A whole bunch of motherboards just got announced at CES, and that includes the B850 chipset for AMD. Shout out to Asus for sponsoring this video. They sent over the Strix B850A gaming Wi-Fi motherboard, and we're going to pair that with a 9800X3D and put together a gaming PC. Asus also sent over the ROG Ryujin 360 ARGB Extreme Cooler, and we're going to use that to keep the CPU cool. We're going to drop in 48 gigabytes of RAM. It's a 6400 megahertz at CL32, I believe. For the storage, this board can do PCIe 5, so I am going to use a 2 terabyte PCIe 5 boot drive, and then we've got 2 random 4 terabyte drives for storage. So that's going to give us a total of 10 terabytes of storage for games. Enough for all those Humble Bundle games to be installed locally, even though you're never going to play them. We've got an 850 watt MSI power supply. It's white, it has a PCIe 5 connector. 850 watts should be plenty for this system. The 50 series and the new AMD cards aren't out yet, so for now I'm just going to reuse my 4080. It's white, it'll fit the build. Then for the case, we're going to use the Lian Lancool 207. It's a fairly compact ATX case. Has a pretty interesting setup with the power supply in the front and some intake fans underneath the GPU. It got really good review on Gamers Nexus, so I'm interested to see how it works out. The B850 board does have some interesting features though, and it's cheaper than going with an X870. You're still getting PCIe 5 support for one of the M.2 slots and the GPU slot. It does memory speed up to DDR5 8000. And it has some interesting design and functionality things going on with the ROG branding, and they have these new suite of Q features, and it's different things like toolless M2 heat sinks, being able to quick release the graphics card without having to press down the little button on the PCI slot. It's pretty interesting, so let's get this thing put together and see how the system works out. Let's unbox the motherboard real quick. In here, this is what they're calling the Q antenna. The board does Wi-Fi 7, and this is the external antenna. I don't have a Wi-Fi 7 router here, I run a wired connection. It does have some interesting features though. They have software that helps you position it to get the best signal. The little ends that plug into the motherboard are now quick connectors, so you don't have to screw them in. So it looks like they have put some thought into it. Okay, so here's a look at the board itself, and wow, it does look pretty nice. We have a white or silver kind of PCB with bright white accents and text on it. Pretty nice RGB integrated into the VRM cooler cover, IO cover, whatever you want to call that. I believe we have a 14 plus 2 phase VRM, 4 DIMM slots. Up here, this is your quick release. I need to look in the manual so I don't break this trying to mess with it. But this is a quick release with the 5.0 slot under here. This does 5.0. So if you have 3 total drives, you want to use slots 1, 3, and 4. Or 1, 2, and 4, I believe. Check your motherboard. One of the slots, I believe slot 3, is disabled if you're running your graphics card in here. But this is all under a nice heatsink with some nice branding. It's all metal. We got a couple hidden little SATA things under here. Looks like you get 2 SATA connectors. Overall, it's a pretty nice looking motherboard. And we have some pretty decent I/O on the back here. This is B850, so we don't get USB 4 like on X870. We got 20 gig USB, 10 gig USB. These are both just USB 2, and this one's your BIOS flash slot. We got another Type C and a Type A that are both 10G, and then a 5 gigabit for these 4 USB 2 ports. Then you got your display outs, your Wi-Fi connections, line in, mic in, and SPDIF out. Then over here you've got a clear CMOS button and your BIOS flashback. which would go along with this corresponding USB port. And we get 2.5 gigabit LAN. And here we've got our 9800X3D. I actually managed to snag this from Newegg for MSRP a few days after launch on one of the first restocks, and I was just sitting on it, not wanting to drop it into my new system because I knew this board was coming on the way, so I've been waiting to use this sucker. Okay, I've got the little accessory box here that comes in the bottom of the case. It's got all your screws and standoffs and things like that. Don't lose any of the motherboard screws because they don't give you any extras. They do give you a couple of replacement clips though. I believe that's for, you know, if these little doohickeys break, then you can replace it with some of these. That's nice for them to include. You can see here part of the design that makes this case unique. You have your power supply up here, which is connected with an extension cable to the back, which frees up all this space. And so there's mesh on this side. You can see the mesh over here. So all of that air is drawn in, and these fans blow it up directly into the GPU. And then you have two 140s for intake up here. So that's a lot of fresh air moving through. We're not going to do any rear exhaust fan, but we are going to have that 360 AIO radiating up through the top. So this should, in theory, give us some pretty good airflow and temperatures. I'm interested to try this out. It's a unique case. You don't see a lot of big changes in the small case, you know, as far as basic layout goes, especially at under $100. This is an $80 case. So to have all these fans included and some of these features for 80 bucks, I think it's a really interesting case. Okay, now we've got the board in there. It's starting to look like something. That looks pretty nice in that case, don't you think? So this has this recessed motherboard tray. If you can see this, it comes out and then goes about an inch back. So the heat sinks are basically level with the front of this. And it gives it a really unique look. It's like really integrated with the case. And that also is going to give you some more room out this way to accommodate wider graphics cards. This is actually a pretty small ATX case, but you're still going to be able to fit a good sized card in here. It also has this GPU support bracket deal that you can move between these different slots and raise up and down to have some built-in GPU support. So now I just need to figure out how to do this 360. So let me get that unboxed and figure it out, and then we'll keep going. Okay, I'm figuring out the water cooler stuff, but for the AMD installation, if you do one of these, you gotta do some steps. Make sure that you have the screws in the right spot along the bracket before you put it in, as well as that you have the bracket feet slid up or down to the right position. I believe that's what it means when it says to adjust the retention ring. I'm not sure. It's kind of complicated, but we'll see how it goes. think it's looking pretty sick so far, but there's not a lot I can do with it in its current state, so I'm gonna get off of here, see if I can't get Windows installed, get some drivers, RGB, get the pump set up, and then we'll see how it performs and run some games on this thing. Alright, I'm really happy with how this is coming together so far. Let me show you how I have the BIOS and cooling set up, and then we can jump into some games and benchmarks. In the BIOS for the B850A gaming Wi-Fi, and it's actually a pretty nice BIOS. I'm here in the basic mode, which it starts up at by default, but you can also go into the advanced mode by clicking F7 or just clicking down there. In here you have access to all your settings. B850 lets you overclock, the 9800X3D lets you overclock. Inside the Precision Boost Overdrive settings, I've just done a really basic overclock. I have the PBO scalar set for 5x, the positive override enabled for 200 megahertz. That's the most it'll let you do. Inside the curve optimizer, I have it set for all cores for a -30, and that's basically what I'm running at, in addition to the memory, which I have enabled here, Expo settings for DDR5 6400. There's also this cool new Q dashboard, and it's basically a diagram of the whole motherboard, and you can click on any of these things and it'll take you right to the settings for that component. You have fan configuration, memory and CPU overclocking. Really, basically anything that you'd want to do is here in this BIOS. Here inside of Armory Crate, I have everything synced with the Aura lighting, and I just have a rainbow effect going on. There's several different rainbow color combos that you can pick from, as well as the different effects. And if you want to get crazy, there's the Aura Creator, where you can make your own. Then we'll go into the Ryujin Extreme Water Cooler settings, and in here is where you can upload and select different animated GIFs or still images, and they have some pre-made animations that you can use if you don't want to upload your own. It gives you some pretty good options. You can use GIFs, MP4s. There's also the hardware monitor section, and you can pick several different items that you want to monitor and what statistics from them you want to display. There's a few different looks you can pick from, or you can upload a custom background and put your own, stuff behind there. You might want to pick an image where it's going to be a little more readable than mine. There's also a fan section. Now this is just for the fan inside the pump. If you want the real fans, you want to go over to the Fan Expert. This is where you can control the fans attached to the motherboard headers. Here you can see my CPU fan curve. I don't have it set as high as it was by default. It was kind of loud, so I set it to only max out when it gets up to 95 degrees and to stay pretty cool below that. I also have the chassis fans, the two under the GPU and the two in the front of the case, set to only run at about 50% speed, unless you get into crisis mode and it gets up to 95C for some reason. You can also control the speed up and speed down of the fans, which I adjusted for the CPU here, because it was kind of a stark on and off when you hit a high load by default. First in the games, we've got Cyberpunk 2077. We're running this at 4K on the Ray Tracing Overdrive preset, and this is with path tracing, with ray reconstruction, but we're using DLSS on balance and frame generation. This did a surprisingly good job for having path tracing and all the bells and whistles turned on. I know that the frame generation is really helping save us and push us over 60, but for a single player game I think this would be pretty playable. And at 4K with path tracing, ray reconstruction, but with DLSS on balance, we got an average of over 70 frames per second, which that's pretty impressive. Next, I wanted to see what kind of crazy high frame rates this 9800X3D could do. So I loaded up the Final Fantasy XIV benchmark, which is pretty easy to run, and put it at 1080p on the high settings, and this put out some crazy numbers like I've never seen before. We were getting 300, 400, 500 frames per second during this. There are even some sections where we became CPU limited at 1080p on the 4080, where it was dropping from full utilization. Even in these scenarios though, the CPU temperature stayed really cool, and the 9800X3D seems to be doing a really killer job. Like, I've never seen any other chip put out numbers like this in this game. Next up is Hogwarts Legacy. I had auto HDR on my PC, so some of this footage might look undersaturated, some is going to look oversaturated. I tried, but it's hard to mess with. Anyways, this is running at 4K with DLAA anti-aliasing and no upscaling, and we're running it on the ultra settings. And running through Hogsmeade here, we're getting about 70 frames per second, which that doesn't seem like a lot, but this is a really hard to run game, especially on the ultra settings. You will notice a little hiccup or dip here and there, but this is far and away the smoothest I've ever seen this game running at such high settings. If you look at the RAM usage, we're using about 16 gigs almost just for this game alone, and our total RAM usage is about 25 gigs, so this is definitely one where you want to have a 32 gig kit or better. But our system seems to be keeping up no problem, and of course this would definitely be a nice system to play some Hogwarts on. Next, I wanted to see what kind of frames we could push out in Fortnite. So we're running this at 1080p DirectX 12 on low settings with the epic view distance. And we're getting 400 or 500 frames per second. So if you play some competitive Fortnite, this is definitely a setup that you could get into a tournament with, I think. You can see in the frame time graph there weren't a lot of stutters, and this is with doing shadow play recording, so in my experience that can often introduce some stutters where once you stop frame recording you're going to get an even smoother experience. But yeah, I think just about any Fortnite player would be happy jumping into a match with this system. And finally, I just wanted to run some Forza Horizon 5 to see what that would do. And we're running this on 4K extreme settings with DLAA anti-aliasing. This isn't the most hard to run game, so of course this PC will handle it no problem, but I just wanted to see what kind of a frame rate we could get and what the stutter count would be like, because this can be CPU heavy in certain situations. And then when we got to the results page, I was pretty surprised to see the stutter count at 0, and we got 116 frames at native 4K with DLAA. So even though it's not a hard to run game, it is really nice seeing it play that smoothly at such high settings. I'm really impressed with this build so far. The 9800X3D is a total beast for gaming. The B850A gaming Wi-Fi was able to get the RAM up and running at expo speed no problem, and it was really easy to get a good overclock going on the CPU. It also looks pretty cool if you ask me. So is the Ryujin 360 Extreme ARGB cooler. It does have a huge name, and it's a kind of overkill for the 9800X3D, but it's definitely a showpiece, and it's the first thing that catches your eye when you look at the build. It also just did a good job at cooling. It kept the CPU in the 50s during most gaming sessions, and that's with the fans at a relatively modest curve and not, pushed to the extreme for the ultimate cooling. The 4080 is still a great card, but I'm really hoping to get my hands on possibly a white 50 series model when those release pretty soon. Thanks to Asus for sponsoring this build, and thanks to you for watching along. I'll have affiliate links for the parts I use down in the video description. Let me know in the comments what you think about this case, the motherboard, and the build in general. If you want to see more of my builds and videos, make sure you're subscribed, and I'll catch you in the next one.